In the shadow of Montana's Gallatin Range, a lone figure tends to his cattle at dawn. His weathered hands move with practiced efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The locals know him only as Marcus Stone, the mute rancher who communicates through gestures and written notes. What they don't know is that his silence masks a truth written in blood and gunpowder, a past that's about to catch up with him when a gang of outlaws mistakes his quiet nature for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost painted the Gallatin Valley in shades of silver and white, the autumn air sharp enough to cut. Marcus Stone stood at the edge of his property, his breath forming clouds in the cold as he watched his cattle graze in the distance. His ranch, nestled against the mountains like a ship against a storm, was coming alive with the first light of dawn. The scars on his throat, visible just above his collar, caught the early sunlight. They were old wounds, telling a story he couldn't voice, not that he would have chosen to speak of it even if he could. The locals had their theories about his muteness, a tragic accident, a birth defect, or maybe just the eccentricity of a man who preferred solitude. None of them came close to the truth. Marcus adjusted his worn leather gloves, his movements deliberate and efficient as he began his morning routine. The ranch had been his home for 5 years now, each day marked by the rhythm of caring for the land and animals. It was a different life from before, a quieter life, measured in sunrises and seasons rather than missions and body counts. Sarah Chen, his ranch hand, arrived as she did every morning at 6 sharp. Her pickup truck announced itself with the familiar crunch of gravel under tires. She was one of the few people who knew how to read him, to understand the subtle shifts in his expression and the economy of his gestures. More importantly, she knew when to let the silence be. "Morning, boss," she called out, pulling on her work jacket. Thompson called. Said there's been trouble over at the Miller place. Strangers asking questions. Marcus turned to her, his steel gray, eyes narrowing slightly. His hands moved in precise gestures, American Sign Language, which Sarah had learned specifically to work with him. What kind of questions? He signed. About the valley, about who owns what. They didn't look like developers or real estate types, more like trouble looking for a place to happen. Sarah hesitated, then added, they were riding motorcycles, nice ones, custom jobs. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He pulled out the small notepad he always carried, jotting down instructions in his precise handwriting. Check the fence line. All of it. Note any signs of disturbance. Sarah read the note and nodded, understanding. The gravity in his expression. You think they're going to be a problem? Marcus didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the tree line, where the morning mist still clung to the pines. After a moment, he wrote another note. Problems can be handled. The morning progressed. With its usual tasks, mending fences, checking on the pregnant heifers, and clearing a fallen tree from the north pasture. But there was a tension in Marcus's shoulders that hadn't been there before. A heightened awareness that Sarah recognized from the rare moments when his guard truly went up. Around midday, the distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley. Marcus was in the barn organizing tools when he heard it, his hands stilled on the wrench he was holding, his posture shifting subtly. To most, it would have seemed like nothing, just a man pausing in his work. But there was something in the way he held himself, the slight adjustment of his stance that spoke of years of training. The motorcycles grew louder, then slowed as they passed the ranch's main entrance. Marcus moved to the barn door, his movements casual but calculated. 3 riders had stopped at his gate, their bikes gleaming in the autumn sun. They were studying his property with too much interest for casual passers-by. The leader, a man with a silver-streaked beard and a leather jacket that had seen better days, noticed Marcus watching. He raised a hand in what might have been meant as a friendly wave, but there was nothing friendly in his eyes. Marcus returned the gesture with a slight nod, his expression neutral. Sarah approached from the side pasture, her boots kicking up dust. She positioned herself near Marcus, her hand resting casually near the tool belt where she kept a heavy wrench. "Want me to see what they want?" Marcus shook his head slightly, then signed, "Watch the back of the property. They never travel alone." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the implication, but she nodded and moved off, taking the long way around the barn to appear casual. Marcus continued to watch the riders, noting every detail. The way they positioned their bikes, the bulges under their jackets that suggested concealed weapons, the practiced way they scanned their surroundings. The leader revved his engine, the sound echoing off the barn walls like distant thunder. Then, with a final long look at the ranch house, the three riders pulled away, their bikes kicking up gravel as they accelerated down the road. Marcus waited until they were out of sight before returning to the barn. He moved to the back wall, where a locked cabinet held basic veterinary supplies. His fingers traced the edge of the cabinet before finding a hidden latch. The false back swung open silently, revealing a space he hadn't accessed in years. Inside lay a case, its surface covered in dust, but its locks still gleaming. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, his scarred throat working slightly as if trying to form words that would never come. The case contained remnants of another life, the life of Master Sergeant Marcus Stone, Delta Force operator, before a mission in Syria went catastrophically wrong and took his voice along with his team. He closed the cabinet without touching the case. Not yet, but for the first time in 5 years, he felt the weight of his dog tags against his chest, hidden beneath his shirt. A reminder that beneath the quiet rancher lay a man who knew intimately the price of peace and the cost of violence. Sarah found him later by the north fence, replacing a loose post. She held up her phone, showing him a text message from Thompson. "They're asking about water rights, testing who's willing to sell." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. He pulled out his notepad and wrote, "They'll be back. Tell Thompson to warn the others. Lock up at night." "You know something about these guys, don't you?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Marcus's hands moved slowly in response. "I know their type. They look for quiet places, places they think are soft targets." "And are we?" Sarah asked her. "A soft target?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. He wrote one final note for the day. "They'll find out soon enough." Inside the house, Marcus reviewed the day's events in his journal, a habit carried over from his military days. His handwriting was precise, each letter carefully formed as he documented the strangers' appearance, their behaviors, and the subtle signs that marked them as more than common troublemakers. The leather-bound book was filled with similar entries, a silent chronicle of a life lived in careful observation. The kitchen counter held a half-empty cup of coffee and the local newspaper. The headline caught his eye: "Drought concerns rise as water rights disputes continue." Marcus had seen this pattern before, not just in his military days, but in other, quiet corners of the world. Resources became scarce, and then the predators arrived, dressed in different clothes but carrying the same old hunger for power. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window, he saw Sheriff C. Dana Martinez's patrol car in his driveway, its lights off. The sheriff was a regular visitor, not just because of her job, but because she was one of the few people who'd made an effort to learn basic sign language when Marcus first arrived in the valley. "Evening, Marcus," she said as he opened the door. Her expression was troubled, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual. "Thought you should know those bikers who've been around. They're not just passing through, they've registered a business in town. Mountain Valley Resources, they're calling it. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his hands moved deliberately. Shell company. Looks that way, Dana nodded. They've got paperwork, licenses, everything looks legal on the surface. But I've been doing this job long enough to smell when something's off. She hesitated, then added, they've been asking about you specifically, about your ranch, your water rights, and about why you don't talk. Marcus retrieved his notepad. Let them ask. Makes it easier to know what they want. Dana studied him, and for a moment. You know, when you first came here, I ran your background check. Everything came back clean, too clean almost, like someone had gone through and sanitized it. She wasn't asking a question, but her implication was clear. Marcus's response was to pull out an old photograph from his desk drawer. It showed him in his dress uniform at his sister's wedding before Syria, before the silence. He handed it to Dana, who examined it carefully. Delta Force, she said quietly, noting the insignia. That explains a few things. She returned the photo. Just be careful, Marcus. These guys, whatever they're really after, they're organized, and they're not afraid to push. After Dana left, Marcus walked his property one final time, a habit that had kept him alive in other places, in another life. The moon was rising over the mountains, casting everything in silver and shadow. Near the back fence, he found fresh cigarette butts. Someone had been watching his ranch, observing, planning. In the barn, he finally opened the hidden cabinet, removing the dusty case he'd avoided earlier. Inside, nestled in foam, lay the tools of his former trade. A disassembled M40A6 sniper rifle, its parts pristine despite years of storage, and a set of combat knives that had never lost their edge. His fingers traced the familiar shapes, muscle memory stirring like a waking beast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's truck appeared at the end of his driveway, her headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. She'd insisted on making one final check of the property before heading home. As she approached the barn, Marcus closed and concealed the case, but not before removing a single item, a tactical flashlight that had served him well in darker places than this. "Perimeter's clear," Sarah reported, then noticed the flashlight in his hand. "That's military gear, isn't it?" When he nodded, she continued, "You going to tell me what we're really dealing with here?" Marcus considered for a moment, then signed slowly. "Men like these, they think silence means weakness. They look for soft targets, quiet places where people would rather look away than fight. They find a foothold, then take everything. And what do we do about it?" Marcus's smile was cold in the fading light. He wrote one final note for the day. "We let them make assumptions. Sometimes the best weapon is being underestimated." As the night settled fully over the Gallatin Valley, Marcus stood on his porch, watching the day fade. In the distance, a coyote called out, a lonely sound that echoed through the valley. He felt the familiar weight of silence pressing against his scarred throat, but for once, it didn't feel like a burden. His hands moved in the darkness, signing words no one was there to see. Let them come. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, and if trouble came looking for him, it would find that some silences held more danger than any words could express. In the depths of his ranch house, the hidden case waited, a reminder that peace was sometimes won, not through strength of voice, but through the willingness to act when words failed. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind that Marcus Stone had learned to distrust during his years in combat. The air felt heavy with anticipation, like the moments before a firefight. He stood in his kitchen, sipping black coffee and watching the sun climb over the Gallatin Range. when his phone buzzed with a text from Thompson. "Miller sold out. They're moving in." Old Jim Miller's ranch bordered Marcus's property to the north, sharing the crucial Thompson Creek water access that fed both their lands. The news settled in Marcus's gut like cold lead. Miller had been ranching that land for 30 years. His sudden decision to sell couldn't mean anything good. Sarah arrived earlier than usual, her face tight with concern. "Heard about Miller," she said, hanging her jacket by the door. "He's not the only one. The Hendersons are talking about selling too. Whatever Mountain Valley Resources is offering, it's way above market value." Marcus's hands moved in sharp, precise gestures. "They're isolating us, creating pressure." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of heavy vehicles approaching drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they watched a convoy of black SUVs roll past the ranch entrance, headed toward Miller's property. The vehicles were new, expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the morning sun like dark mirrors. "Count them," Marcus signed, his eyes never leaving the convoy. 4 SUVs, 3 bikes following, Sarah reported. "They're not trying to be subtle anymore." Marcus pulled out his notepad. "Good. Confident people make mistakes." The morning's work proceeded as usual, but with an undercurrent of tension that set every nerve on edge. Marcus and Sarah were repairing irrigation lines near the property border when the first confrontation came. 2 men in expensive boots and cheap suits approached from Miller's side of the fence, their pathway deliberate. "Mr. Stone," the taller one called out. "Mason Brooks, Mountain Valley Resources. We'd like a moment of your time." Marcus straightened slowly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes hard as granite. Sarah stepped forward, ready to translate, but Brooks waved her off. "No need for that, we've done our homework." Brooks pulled out a folder. "We know about your condition. Makes things simpler, really. You can just listen." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his hands flex slightly. At his sides, a subtle tell she'd learned to recognize as controlled anger. "We're developing the valley's water resources," Brooks continued, his tone professionally pleasant. "Progress, infrastructure, jobs, all the good stuff. Jim Miller understood the opportunity. We're offering you the same deal. 3 times. Market value for your water rights. You keep the land, we handle the water. Simple." Marcus pulled out his notepad, wrote a single word. "No." Brooks's smile tightened. "Mr. Stone, let me be clear. This is happening. The valley's changing. You can profit from it or—" He gestured vaguely, letting the threat hang unspoken. Marcus wrote another note. "You did your homework, do more." The second man stepped forward, his hands sliding beneath his jacket. "Listen, you mute son of—" What happened next was so fast, Sarah almost missed it. Marcus moved like liquid lightning, his hands snapping out to grab the man's wrist. There was a subtle twist, a soft pop, and the man stumbled back, his face white with pain. He hadn't even managed to draw whatever he was reaching for. Brooks grabbed his partner's shoulder, pulling him back. "Easy, easy, just a misunderstanding." His smile was gone now, replaced by something colder. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Stone. Think about our offer. Change is coming, whether you want it or not." As they walked away, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was, "I've never seen you move like that." Marcus's response was typically understated, bad form. He telegraphed. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulled up to the ranch. She wasn't alone. A tall man in a federal marshal's badge stepped out with her, his presence adding another layer of tension to an already charged day. "Marcus!" Dana called out, her expression grim. "This is Marshal Roberts. He has some questions about our new friends at Mountain Valley Resources." Inside the house, Roberts spread photos across the kitchen table. They showed familiar faces. The bikers who'd been scouting the valley, including some Marcus hadn't seen yet. "These men," Roberts said, are connected to a group we've been tracking. They find vulnerable communities, typically during resource crises, drought, mining, disputes, timber rights. They move in legal at first, but once they have a foothold. He tapped one photo showing a burnt-out ranch house. Things tend to get complicated. Marcus studied the photos, his face impassive. His hands moved in careful signs, which Dana translated. He's asking if they've done this before. 3 other states, Roberts confirmed, but they're careful. Witnesses either disappear or suddenly can't remember anything useful. Local law enforcement gets tied up in red tape. By the time we build a case, they've usually stripped the area and moved on. Marcus wrote a note. Why tell me this? Roberts leaned forward. Because they've never failed to take what they want, and right now they want your water rights. We've got informants saying they're planning something big, but we can't move without proof. We need your help, Mr. Stone. Another note. How? Be bait, Roberts said bluntly. Let them think you're weakening. Give them rope to hang themselves. Marcus's expression hardened. He wrote 2 words. Too dangerous. For who? Roberts pressed. These men aren't just thugs, Mr. Stone. They're organized, well-funded, and they've got friends in high places. We need to catch them in the act, and your ranch might be our best chance. After they left, Marcus walked his property lines again, his mind working through scenarios with the precision that had kept him alive in combat. The valley was changing, just as Brooks had said, but change didn't always flow in the expected direction. Near sunset, he found fresh tire tracks cutting across his back pasture. Someone had been testing his fences, looking for weak points. A cattle gate had been deliberately left open, though Sarah had sworn she'd locked it that morning. In the barn, Marcus opened the hidden case again. This time, he removed more than just the flashlight. The familiar weight of his combat knife settled against his ankle, hidden beneath his boot. A small radio transmitter, still functional after years of storage, went into his jacket pocket. He wasn't accepting Roberts's offer, not yet, but preparation had been drilled into him long before he lost his voice. Sarah found him securing the barn for the night. We should put up cameras, she suggested. Trail cams, maybe some motion. Sensors. Marcus nodded, then signed, already ordered. But they won't come at us straight, not yet. What will they do? Pressure, isolation, fear. His hands moved with grim certainty. Standard tactics, break the target's will before the real attack. And what will we do? Marcus's smile was sharp in the gathering darkness. He wrote a final note for the day. We'll adapt, survive, and when the time comes, we'll show them why silence doesn't mean weakness. Later that night, Marcus sat at his desk, updating his journal. He documented the day's events with military precision. Brooks's threats, the marshal's warning, the signs of intrusion. In the margin, he sketched a rough map of the valley, marking potential observation points and likely approaches. His training was surfacing, old instincts awakening like winter wolves, scenting prey. The phone buzzed, another text from Thompson. Henderson's signed the papers. MVR moves in tomorrow. Marcus closed the journal slowly. The noose was tightening, just as he'd expected. But what Mountain Valley Resources didn't understand was that a noose could strangle the hangman just as easily as the hanged. As evening settled over the valley, Marcus drove into town for supplies, his truck's headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Main Street had changed subtly since Mountain Valley Resources arrived. The usual friendly waves were replaced by averted gazes, and conversations died as he passed. Fear was taking root, spreading like poison through the community. At the general store, old Pete Davidson pulled him aside. The store owner's weathered face was creased with worry as he slipped Marcus a note. They were asking about your military service, offering money for information. Some folks are talking. Marcus nodded, his thanks, his expression unchanged. Inside, though, his tactical mind was already processing the implications. They were building a profile, trying to understand their opponent. But they were asking the wrong questions, looking in the wrong places. On the drive home, he spotted one of the black SUVs parked on a side road, its engine running. They weren't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. Marcus took a longer route back, using the skills that had kept him alive in hostile territories to detect any tails or observation posts. At the ranch, he found Sarah waiting with news of her own. They approached Jeremy at the feed store. She said, following him into the barn, offered him a job as their local liaison, twice his current salary, benefits, and work. He turned them down, but Marcus raised an eyebrow, prompting her to continue. But they mentioned his daughter's college, tuition, how hard it is for a single dad to afford good schools. They knew the details, Marcus, personal details. Marcus's hands moved decisively. They're profiling everyone, looking for pressure points. Later that night, unable to sleep, Marcus descended into his cellar. Behind a false wall panel lay another relic of his past, a ruggedized laptop, maintained, but unused for years. He powered it on, the screen casting a blue glow in the darkness. His fingers moved across the keyboard, accessing encrypted files that documented operations similar to what he was seeing now. He had encountered groups like Mountain Valley Resources before, in places torn by resource conflicts and tribal disputes. They always followed the same playbook: isolate, intimidate, divide. But they had never faced someone who had not only studied their tactics, but had once been tasked with stopping operations just like theirs. A noise outside pulled him from his research. Through the cellar's narrow window, he caught movement near the tree line. Flashlight beams, at least two people moving with purpose. Marcus moved silently up the stairs and out the back door, using the shadows as cover. The intruders were professionals, moving with military precision, but they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed the ranch's security began at its fences. They never noticed the pressure plates Marcus had installed weeks ago, hidden beneath a thin layer of soil. As they crossed the invisible line, silent alarms buzzed in Marcus's pocket. He allowed himself a grim smile as he documented their movements with his phone's camera. Evidence, just as Marshal Roberts had requested, though not quite in the way the lawman had intended. When he finally returned to bed, the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern sky. His throat ached, as it often did when tension built, a reminder of the ambush that had taken his voice. But he had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon just as powerful as any sound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new provocations. Mountain Valley Resources would continue their campaign of pressure and intimidation, but Marcus Stone had survived worse odds in darker places. They thought his silence was a weakness, his solitude a vulnerability. Soon enough, they would learn the truth that his old team had known well. The most dangerous predators were often the ones you never heard coming. The memory of Syria still lingered in Marcus's mind as dawn broke over the Gallatin Range. He was already dressed and checking the property when Sarah's truck pulled up earlier than usual. Her face was drawn with concern. "They hit Henderson Place last night," she said without preamble. "Someone cut their fence lines, scattered their cattle. The police say it could have been teenagers, but—" She trailed off as Marcus's expression hardened. He pulled out his notepad. "Show me." They drove to the Henderson Ranch in Marcus's truck, the morning fog still clinging to the valleys. Beth Henderson met them at her gate, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. 30. "Heads scattered," she reported, leading them to the damaged fence. "Found most of them, but 6 are still missing, and look at these cuts." She pointed to the wire. "Clean, precise. No teenager did this." Marcus knelt to examine the fence. The cuts were indeed professional, angled to avoid reflection, spaced to cause maximum dispersal of the herd. He'd seen similar tactics used to disrupt supply lines in combat zones. His hands moved in quick signs to Sarah. Marcus says this was coordinated, she translated for Beth. Multiple people, military training. They wanted it to look random, but it wasn't. Beth's face paled. The offer from Mountain Valley Resources. They said we had until Friday to decide. This happened the same night we told them no. Marcus stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He wrote a note. Install cameras. I'll help. And Beth, don't let your boys patrol alone at night. As they drove back, Sarah broke the tense silence. It's going to get worse, isn't it? Marcus nodded, then pulled over at a scenic overlook. He took out his notepad, writing more than he usually did. They're escalating faster than expected. Means they're on a timeline, pressure from above. What kind of timeline? Water rights have to be secured before winter. They need control of the valley's resources before the snow melts. Back at his ranch, Marcus found Marshal Roberts waiting with Sheriff Martinez. The marshal's typically composed demeanor showed cracks of frustration. 3 more ranches reported vandalism last night, Roberts said as they gathered in Marcus's kitchen. All families who refuse to sell. We know it's Mountain Valley Resources, but we can't prove it. They're using prose, no prints, no witnesses. Dana added, and now we've got reports of armed security patrols on the properties they've bought. All licensed, all legal, but they're marking territory, Marcus signed with Dana translating. Creating boundaries, isolating holdouts. Exactly, Roberts confirmed. They're establishing control, piece by piece, and their corporate paperwork is pristine. Every permit, every license perfectly filed. Someone with serious resources is backing them. Marcus wrote a note. You're not telling me everything. Roberts and Dana exchanged glances. Finally, the marshal pulled out his phone, showing Marcus a photo. It showed Brooks meeting with a man whose face Marcus knew all too well. Colonel James Haywood, his former commanding officer, taken 2 weeks ago in Washington, Roberts said quietly. Whatever Mountain Valley Resources is really doing here, it goes deeper than water rights. We're thinking of private military contract work, possibly Black Ops testing grounds. But we can't prove anything without... An explosion rocked the valley, the sound rolling across the ranch like thunder. They rushed outside to see smoke rising from the direction of Thompson's property. Marcus was already moving, Sarah close. Behind him, they found Thompson's irrigation pump house in flames, the expensive equipment inside destroyed. Thompson himself stood nearby, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Didn't see them, he said, his voice shaking. Just heard bikes, then the explosion. Finally got that proof you wanted, Marshal. But Roberts shook his head grimly. Proof and can't use. The cameras on your property mysteriously malfunctioned an hour ago, and I bet any witnesses will suddenly have trouble remembering details. Marcus surveyed the destruction, his tactical mind cataloguing details others might miss. The explosion was precise, designed to destroy specific equipment while minimizing collateral damage. This wasn't vandalism. It was a message. He wrote a note to Roberts. Your way isn't working. Time for mine. Marcus, Dana warned, reading the note. Don't do anything. He cut her off with a sharp gesture, then wrote, They want to play soldiers. Fine. Let's give them a war they don't expect. That night, after everyone had left, Marcus made 3 calls using a secure satellite phone he'd kept for emergencies. The first was to a number he'd memorized years ago, belonging to a former teammate who now worked in private intelligence. The second was to a weapons dealer he'd once saved in Baghdad. The third was to a woman in Virginia who specialized in electronic warfare. Each conversation was conducted through text messages, each response affirming what Marcus already knew. When he called, his old contacts would answer. After all, the silent warrior, as he'd been known in Delta Force, had never called in his markers before. In his cellar office, Marcus pulled up satellite imagery of the valley on his secure laptop, marking the properties Mountain Valley Resources had acquired. A pattern emerged. They were creating a corridor, much like the ones used for clandestine transport in conflict zones. Whatever they were planning went far beyond water rights. Sarah found him there hours later, surrounded by maps and tactical assessments. "I know that look," she said quietly. "I saw it on my brother's face in Afghanistan. You're planning something." Marcus nodded, then signed slowly. "They think they're the only ones who know how to fight dirty. Time to educate them." "What do you need from me?" He wrote his response carefully. "Same thing my team needed. Eyes, ears, and absolute trust. This gets ugly from here." Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "They hurt my friends, threaten my home. I'm in, all the way." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. By targeting the whole valley, Mountain Valley Resources had made a crucial mistake. They assumed isolated ranches would be easy targets. They never considered that some wolves hunt better in packs. As midnight approached, Marcus stood on his porch watching distant headlights move along the valley roads. Mountain Valley Resources security patrols, marking their territory. Let them patrol, he thought. Let them think they have the advantage of numbers and resources. His hand moved to his throat, feeling the scar tissue that had silenced him years ago. In Syria, he'd learned that losing his voice didn't mean losing his power. Now, Mountain Valley Resources was about to learn the same lesson. Some warriors didn't need words to wage war. Sometimes silence itself was a weapon enough. In his bedroom, Marcus opened a hidden wall panel and removed a small box. Inside lay his old Delta Force insignia and a folded American flag, reminders of the man he'd been and the skills he still possessed. Tomorrow, the real fight will begin, and this time he wouldn't be constrained by rules of engagement or chains of command. They wanted his water rights. First, they'd have to learn about drought. He would cut off their resources, isolate their operations, and introduce them to a kind of fear they never expected to find in this quiet valley. By the time he was done, they'd understand why his former team had called him the Silent Warrior. The war for the valley was about to enter a new phase, and Marcus Stone was finally ready to show these invaders why some battles are lost the moment. You mistake silence for weakness. Dawn hadn't yet touched the Gallatin Range when Marcus Stone began his counteroffensive. He moved through the pre-dawn darkness with practiced stealth, his boots making no sound on the frost-covered ground. The first of his surveillance equipment had arrived via private courier the previous night, cutting-edge gear that would never be found in a ranch supply store. Sarah arrived to find him installing a sophisticated motion sensor beneath the weathered boards of an old fence post. She watched him work, noting how his movements had changed. Gone was the careful, measured pace of a rancher. This was something else, something lethal. "Your contact came through," she said, holding up a satellite phone. "Says the rest of the equipment will be here by nightfall. And Marcus..." She hesitated. "He said to tell you, Babylon sends regards." Marcus's hands stilled for a moment. He hadn't heard that code phrase since Syria. His old team was mobilizing, just as he'd requested. He nodded, then signed, "Time to start pushing back." Their first move was subtle, as Mountain Valley Resources security patrols made their morning rounds. They found their radio communications plagued by interference. Their GPS systems showed them miles from their actual locations. Small disruptions, but enough to create uncertainty, to shake their confidence. By mid-morning, Mason Brooks arrived at the ranch unannounced, his black SUV kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. This time, he wasn't playing the role of friendly businessman. Two hard-faced men flanked him, their stances marking them as ex-military. "Your tricks with our communications end now," Brooks said flatly. "We know what you're doing, Stone. You're not the only one with resources. Marcus stood quietly, his expression neutral. Sarah started to step forward, but he held up a hand, stopping her. His notepad came out. "No tricks. Bad equipment happens." "Cut the act," Brooks snapped. "Colonel Haywood warned us about you. The silent warrior, wasn't it? Said you were dangerous if cornered. But this isn't a battlefield, Stone. This is business." Marcus wrote another note. "You made it a battlefield." One of Brooks's men moved forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Before he could complete the motion, a red dot appeared on his chest, a laser sight from somewhere in the surrounding trees. A second dot found Brooks's forehead. The men froze. Marcus's expression hadn't changed, but his posture had shifted subtly. Even without words, he projected absolute control of the situation. His next note was brief. "Leave. Next time, dots become holes." After they'd gone, Sarah emerged from her hidden position, lowering the laser designator. "They'll be back with more men." Marcus nodded. "Count on it." But now they're rattled, questioning their intelligence. The day progressed with a series of calculated moves and counter-moves. Mountain Valley Resources sent teams to probe the ranch's defenses, looking for blind spots and weaknesses. Each time, they found evidence that they were being watched, their movements anticipated. Marcus's satellite phone buzzed with updates from his contacts. His former teammate in intelligence had compiled detailed dossiers on Brooks and his operation. The weapons dealer reported that specialized equipment was en route. The electronic warfare specialist had mapped every communication a channel Mountain Valley Resources was using. Around noon, Sheriff Martinez arrived with news. "They're bringing in more men," she reported. "Private security contractors, ex-military types. Heard they've rented out the entire Pine Ridge Motel." Marcus wrote, "How many?" "At least 20 that we've identified." "And Marcus?" She hesitated. "There's something else. Colonel Haywood was spotted at the county courthouse, meeting with judges." Marcus's jaw tightened. Legal pressure would come next. Restraining orders, property disputes, anything to tie his hands while they moved against him. He'd seen this pattern before, in other places where resources and power intersected. That afternoon, he gathered his core allies in the barn. Sarah, Sheriff Martinez, and Thompson, who had refused to leave his property despite the bombing. Marcus laid out maps of the valley, marking key positions and likely approaches. "They'll come at us from multiple angles," he signed, with Sarah translating. "Legal, physical, financial. We need to be ready on all fronts." "What's our play?" Thompson asked, his face still bruised from the explosion. Marcus revealed his plan through a series of notes and signs. They would turn Mountain Valley Resources' tactics against them. Isolation for isolation. Pressure for pressure. But they would add an element the company wasn't expecting, the silent, psychological warfare that had made Marcus legendary in Delta Force. As evening approached, the first phase began. Mountain Valley Resources security patrols found their access roads mysteriously blocked by fallen trees. Their vehicle tires suffered unexplainable flats, equipment malfunctioned. And everywhere they went, they caught glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision, shadows that vanished when directly observed. Marcus watched through high-powered optics as the security teams grew increasingly agitated. Professional soldiers were being reduced to jumping at shadows, and he hadn't even begun to truly push them yet. Sarah found him on the observation post he'd established in an old hunting blind. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" His hands moved in the darkness. "They wanted to play psychological warfare, but they never asked why I was called the Silent Warrior." Back at the ranch house, Marcus received an encrypted message from his intelligence contact. Colonel Haywood had requisitioned military-grade equipment through unofficial channels. Whatever. Mountain Valley Resources was planning. They were preparing to escalate significantly. Marcus spent the night setting up the equipment that had arrived. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, and signal jammers created an invisible web around his property. But his most effective weapons were simpler, carefully positioned mirrors that caught moonlight, creating fleeting reflections that looked like movement. Speakers hidden in trees that played subliminal sounds just at the edge of hearing. Fishing lines strung between trees to create inexplicable touches in the darkness. By midnight, the Pine Ridge Motel was buzzing with activity. Through his surveillance, Marcus watched Mountain Valley Resources contractors planning their next moves. They had maps, satellite imagery, and tactical gear. They thought they were preparing for a simple intimidation operation. They were wrong. Marcus touched the scar on his throat, remembering the ambush in Syria that had taken his voice. His team had been betrayed then, led into a trap by someone they trusted. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Colonel Haywood, his former commander, was now aligned with the forces trying to take his home. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't caught unaware. And this time, his silence wasn't a weakness. To be exploited, it was a weapon honed by years of survival. Sarah insisted on staying at the ranch, setting up a cot in the living room. They might try something tonight, she argued. Test our defenses. Marcus nodded. He wrote a final note for the day. Let them come. Time they learned why silence is deadlier than sound. As the valley settled into darkness, Marcus Stone stood on his porch, watching distant headlights move along the roads. Mountain Valley Resources thought they were dealing with a broken soldier, a mute rancher they could bully into submission. They were about to learn their mistake. Hours before dawn, Marcus conducted a final equipment check in his cellar. The secure laptop displayed thermal imaging feeds from his newly installed cameras, showing Mountain Valley Resources patrols moving through the valley like ghosts in the night. But they weren't the only ones moving under cover of darkness. His satellite phone buzzed, a text from his contact in Virginia. Satellite pass in 20, IR strobes in position. Marcus confirmed the small infrared beacons were active, allowing his allies to track Mountain Valley Resources movements from above. Modern warfare wasn't just about guns and guards, it was about information, and Marcus was making sure he had the advantage. Sarah's voice came through his radio, barely above a whisper. Movement at the north fence. 3 men. Military. Formation. She was positioned in the old hunting blind, using the night vision equipment that had arrived with the latest shipment. Marcus moved silently through his property, years of training evident in every step. The intruders were good. They moved. With discipline, used hand signals, and maintained proper intervals. But they were fighting blind while Marcus could see everything. A subtle pressure on a hidden trigger sent a burst of infrared light flooding the area. Through his tactical goggles, Marcus watched the intruders freeze, momentarily confused by the invisible illumination. Their night vision equipment, suddenly overwhelmed, rendered them effectively blind. What happened next was a masterclass in silent warfare. Marcus moved like a shadow, disciplined violence in human form. The first man went down without a sound, a precise strike to the vagus nerve dropping him instantly. The second spun at the noise, only to find empty air. Marcus was already moving. A swift leg sweep, a controlled fall, and another threat was neutralized. The third man showed his training, immediately dropping into a defensive stance. But he was fighting a ghost, an opponent who had mastered the art of soundless combat. Marcus closed the distance, deflected a wild punch, and ended the confrontation with a technical chokehold that left the man unconscious but unharmed. Sarah's voice crackled in his earpiece. Clear on all channels. No backup incoming. Marcus zip-tied the intruders and collected their equipment, high-end tactical gear with serial numbers filed off. He photographed everything, building evidence, before leaving them at the edge of his property with a note, pinned to their gear. Next time, knock. Back at the ranch house, Sheriff Martinez was waiting with fresh intelligence. "Your friends in Virginia came through," she said, spreading photos across the kitchen table. "Mountain Valley Resources isn't just buying land, they're building something. Underground facilities, hidden from satellite view. But get this, they're using construction permits from 5 years ago, filed under a different company name." Marcus studied the photos, his tactical mind piecing together the puzzle. His hands moved in quick signs. Not just water rights. They're creating infrastructure, hidden transport routes. For what? Before Marcus could respond, Thompson's truck came roaring up the driveway, gravel spraying. He burst into the kitchen, his face pale. "They just arrested Beth Henderson. Some bullshit about environmental violations, but they're holding her without bail." Marcus's expression hardened. He wrote quickly, "It's starting. Legal pressure first, then physical force." "Marcus," Dana said carefully, "if they're pushing this hard, they must be desperate. What aren't we seeing?" He pulled out his secure laptop, bringing up a series of satellite images taken over the past. 5 years, the pictures showed a pattern of land acquisitions across multiple states, all following the same template: isolated communities, resource disputes, and hidden construction. "Not just here," he signed. "They're building a network. Underground transport system using water rights as cover. Transport for what?" Marcus's response was grim. "Whatever they're moving, it's worth killing for." Later that morning, Mason Brooks made another appearance, this time with a legal team in tow. They arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, trying to project authority and control. But Marcus noticed the security details' nervous glances, the way they clustered together. His psychological warfare was working. "Your little tricks with our patrol last night?" "Cute," Brooks said, but his confident smile seemed forced. "But now we're done playing games. You have 24 hours to accept our offer, or we'll take the land through eminent domain. We have judges ready to sign the orders." Marcus stood silently, letting Brooks talk. Sarah started to translate, but he waved her off. "Let them think he was intimidated by their legal threats," Brooks continued, gaining confidence from Marcus's silence. "And those friends of yours, the ones helping you with surveillance? They should be careful. Colonel Haywood has a long memory, and he hasn't forgotten Syria." The mention of Syria triggered something in Marcus, not fear, but a cold, calculating anger. His hands moved in deliberate signs, which Sarah translated with barely concealed satisfaction. "He says you just made your first real mistake." "Oh, and what's that?" "You assumed Syria was his failure," Sarah translated. "It wasn't. It was his education." After they left, Marcus gathered his allies in the barn. Through a combination of signs and written notes, he laid out what he'd learned. Mountain Valley Resources wasn't just a front for land grabs. It was part of a larger operation, using water rights disputes to cover the construction of a hidden transportation network. "But what are they moving?" Thompson asked. "Drugs, weapons." Marcus shook his head. "Something worse, something that needs Colonel Haywood's involvement." He showed them more satellite photos, pointing out similar patterns in other states. Everywhere Mountain Valley Resources went, they left behind hidden infrastructure and silenced communities. Sarah studied the images. "How do we stop something this big?" Marcus's response was methodical. "We start here. Cut off their local operation. Expose their methods. Make them sloppy. They'll come at us hard," Dana warned. "Count on it." Marcus smiled grimly. "That's exactly what we want." That evening, Marcus received another encrypted message from his contact in Virginia. Colonel Haywood had made 3 calls to a secure facility in Nevada, all heavily encrypted. Whatever Mountain Valley Resources was planning, it was accelerating. In his cellar office, Marcus updated his tactical assessment. The enemy had resources, manpower, and political coverage. But they also had weaknesses: rigid command structure, over-reliance on intimidation, and most importantly, they underestimated their opposition. Sarah found him there, studying maps and satellite images. You knew, didn't you? When they first showed up, you knew this was bigger than just water rights. Marcus nodded slowly. His hands moved in the dim light. Recognized the pattern. Same tactics they used overseas. Find isolated communities, create a crisis, offer a solution, take control. And now we change the pattern, make them fight on our terms. He showed her the tactical overview he'd prepared. Mountain Valley Resources had superior numbers and resources, but Marcus had something they couldn't match: intimate knowledge of asymmetric warfare and the patience to wage it properly. As midnight approached, Marcus stood at his bedroom window, watching the valley below. Movement caught his eye. More security patrols, more men with military training. They were preparing for something big. His hand went to his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he'd learned that losing his voice didn't mean losing his ability to fight. Now, Mountain Valley Resources was about to learn the same lesson. Some warriors didn't need words to wage war. Sometimes silence itself was the deadliest weapon of all. The war for the valley was about to escalate, and Marcus Stone was ready. Let them come with their legal threats and armed contractors. Let them think they had the advantage. They were about to learn why his enemies had called him the Silent Warrior, and why those who understood the name spoke it with fear. The ultimatum's deadline approached with the inevitability of an incoming storm. Marcus Stone watched the sun rise over the Gallatin Range, knowing that Mountain Valley Resources wouldn't wait much longer. His surveillance feeds showed increased activity at their temporary headquarters. Vehicles being prepped, men checking weapons, communications equipment being tested. Sarah arrived before dawn, her truck loaded with supplies. "Your contact in Baghdad came through," she said, helping him unload heavy cases marked with military storage codes. "Says we've got about 3 hours before they move." Marcus nodded, his hands moving in quick signs. "They'll try to overwhelm us. Multiple teams, coordinated assault. Are we ready?" His smile was cold in the morning light. "They think they're hunting a crippled rancher. Let's teach them about wolves." The first sign of trouble came at 0900 hours. The rancher's communications went dead, phones, internet, everything. Standard isolation tactics. But Marcus had anticipated this, his satellite equipment humming quietly in the cellar, maintaining their connection to the outside world. Sheriff Martinez's voice crackled over their secure radio. "Multiple vehicles moving your way, Marcus. At least 3 teams. They've got county permits for a safety inspection. The judge signed off on it 10 minutes ago." Marcus moved to his predetermined position, watching through high-powered optics as black SUVs approached from 3 directions. The vehicles stopped just outside his property line, and men in tactical gear began to deploy. They moved with military precision, but their formation betrayed their assumptions. They were expecting resistance from the front, not realizing they were already surrounded. Sarah's voice whispered through his earpiece. "Count 12 tangos. Armed with..." "Those aren't civilian weapons, Marcus. That's military hardware." Marcus touched his throat, feeling the familiar tension of pre-combat silence. But this time, his silence wasn't a handicap. It was exactly what he needed. He clicked his radio, twice, signaling his other allies to begin. The first team of Mountain Valley Resources contractors approached the main gate, led by a man Marcus recognized from his intelligence briefings. Jake Reynolds, ex-Special Forces, now Brooks's chief of security. "Mr. Stone," Reynolds called out. "We have a legal warrant to inspect this property. Cooperate, and this goes smoothly." Marcus emerged from cover, his posture relaxed, hands clearly visible. He pulled out his notepad, wrote something, and held it up. "Show me the warrant." As Reynolds approached with the document, Marcus's trap was sprung. Hidden speakers suddenly blared with the recorded sound of gunfire, causing the tactical team to instinctively dive for cover. In that moment of confusion, Marcus moved. Years of Delta Force training took over. Before Reynolds could recover, Marcus had disarmed him with a precise strike, using the larger man's momentum against him. The rest of the team found their weapons' electronics mysteriously dead, victims of the signal jammers Marcus had installed throughout the property. "Contact rear!" someone shouted, but they were shooting at shadows. Marcus's pre-positioned mirrors and strobes created phantom movements, making it impossible to determine friend from foe. The professional facade of the tactical team crumbled as they began firing wildly at nothing. Sarah's voice remained calm in his earpiece. "Second team moving up the east ridge. Third team holding position at the south fence." Marcus triggered the next phase. The sprinkler system he'd modified began spraying the approaching team not with water, but with a mixture that would render their thermal imaging useless. Simultaneously, hidden speakers played the sound of movement through their blind spots, creating the impression of being surrounded. "Fall back!" Reynolds shouted, finally regaining his feet. "Fall back and regroup!" But retreat wasn't as simple as they'd hoped. Their vehicle's electronics had been scrambled by targeted EMP devices, not enough to permanently damage them, but enough to prevent a quick escape. The professional contractors were reduced to running on foot, their tactical gear weighing them down as they fled from an enemy they couldn't see. Marcus allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction before moving to intercept the third team. These were Brooks's personal security details, more disciplined than the others. They held their position, even as chaos erupted around them. "Stone!" Brooks's voice carried across the property. "You think these parlor tricks change anything? We own this valley, we own the courts, the police." His voice cut off as Marcus's next surprise activated. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Subsonic frequencies transmitted through buried speakers, creating disorientation and panic. The psychological effect was devastating. Even trained operators struggled to maintain composure when their inner ear betrayed them. Sarah's voice reported casualties. No serious injuries, lots of bruised egos. Wait. Incoming vehicle. Different approach vector. A black helicopter appeared over the ridge, its unmarked fuselage suggesting military connections. Marcus recognized the model, a stealth variant used in covert operations. As it descended, he caught a glimpse of the passenger, Colonel Haywood himself. The helicopter landed in the pasture, its rotors kicking up dust. Haywood emerged, his uniform immaculate, his bearing rigid with authority. He surveyed the chaos, his professional contractors scattered, their equipment disabled, their confidence shattered. "Still fighting smart, I see," Haywood called out, his voice carrying years of command. "Syria should have killed you, Stone. Would have been cleaner." Marcus emerged from cover, his movements deliberate. His hands moved in sharp, precise signs that needed no translation. "Syria made me better." "Better." Haywood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look at you. Can't even speak. You're fighting a war you don't understand against an enemy you can't comprehend." Marcus pulled out his notepad, wrote a message, and held it up. "I understand betrayal." Haywood's expression hardened. "You always were too clever. Fine, you've made your point. But this is bigger than your revenge, Stone. The work we're doing here, it's vital to national security." Another note. Like Syria was vital, Syria was a miscalculation. This is different. We're building something important, something necessary. Haywood stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Stand down. Walk away. There's still a place for you in this." Marcus's response was to trigger one final surprise. Every screen, radio, and electronic device in range suddenly displayed the same message. Coordinates, dates, and surveillance photos showing Mountain Valley Resources' hidden operations across multiple states. His intelligence contacts had been busy. "That's not all we have," Sarah called out, emerging from her position with a satellite phone. "Everything's been uploaded. One call, and it goes public. Haywood's facade cracked, showing genuine concern for the first time. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Stone. The facility we're building here, it's essential. The research we're conducting." Marcus cut him off with a sharp gesture. His next note was simple: "Leave. Now. Next time won't be bloodless." The colonel studied him for a long moment, reading something in Marcus's stance that the others missed. Finally, he nodded. "This isn't over, Stone. Not by a long shot." He turned back to his helicopter, pausing only to add, "When the hammer falls, remember, I gave you a chance." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah approached Marcus. "That wasn't their real play, was it?" Marcus shook his head. His hands moved in the growing darkness. "Test run, probing our defenses. Real attack comes next." "How bad?" "Worse," he signed. "Now they know we're ready. Next time, no warnings, no warrants, just war." That night, Marcus sat in his cellar office, updating his tactical assessment. Mountain Valley Resources had shown their hand. Military-grade weapons, professional, contractors, and direct government connections. But they'd also revealed their weaknesses: overconfidence, rigid thinking, and a fatal tendency to underestimate their opponent. Sarah insisted on staying again, helping him process the day's intelligence. "Haywood mentioned research," she said. "What kind of research needs this much security?" Marcus's hands moved slowly in response. "Kind that breaks laws, international laws, like Syria." He nodded grimly. Whatever Mountain Valley Resources was building beneath the valley, it went beyond simple resource control. The presence of Colonel Haywood, the military-grade security, the elaborate cover operation, it all pointed to something darker. As midnight approached, Marcus stood on his porch, watching distant headlights move through the valley. Today's victory had bought them time, but tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mountain Valley Resources would adapt, change tactics, and hit harder. His hand moved to his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he'd learned that survival sometimes meant becoming something your enemies never expected. Now, he would teach that lesson again. The war for the valley was escalating, and Marcus Stone was ready. Let them come with their soldiers and scientists, their weapons and warrants. They would learn what his enemies in Delta Force had discovered the hard way. That silence could be deadlier than any scream, and that some warriors were most dangerous when you couldn't hear them coming. The aftermath of the confrontation brought an uneasy quiet to the Gallatin Valley. Marcus Stone knew better than to mistake it for peace. This was the calm before a greater storm. His satellite feeds showed increased activity at Mountain Valley. Resources acquired properties, with supply trucks arriving under cover of darkness and new security personnel taking up positions. Dawn found him reviewing data from his intelligence contacts on his secure laptop. Sarah entered the cellar office, carrying fresh coffee and a troubled expression. "Beth Henderson's been released," she reported, "but they've frozen her accounts. Bank says it's a routine security review." Marcus's hands moved in sharp, controlled gestures. "They're changing tactics, financial pressure now. That's not all." Sarah placed a USB drive on his desk. "Your contact in Virginia sent this. Said you need to see it immediately." The drive contained satellite imagery of Mountain Valley, Resources' other operations across the country. But these weren't just land purchases. They showed hidden facilities, underground construction, and something more disturbing: medical evacuation helicopters making regular night flights to unmarked locations. A message from his contact accompanied the images, cross-referenced with military contracts. "They're calling it Project Echo. Whatever they're building in your valley, they've built it 6 times before. And Stone, people go in, but they don't come out." Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd seen similar patterns in Syria, where black sites masked themselves as research facilities. His hands moved deliberately. "Human experimentation." Sarah's face paled. like what they did to you in Syria. Worse, he signed. Much worse. Their discussion was interrupted by an urgent call from Sheriff Martinez. "Marcus, we've got trouble. Federal agents just rolled into town. They're claiming jurisdiction over the entire valley, something about national security protocols." Marcus wasn't surprised. It was a standard play. Use federal authority to isolate the target area, control local law enforcement, silence opposition. He'd seen it before, but never on American soil. "How many?" he signed, with Sarah translating. 24 at least, all armed, all wearing tactical gear under their suits. "And Marcus, they're not just any feds. These are the Black Site Division." The name sent a chill through the room. Black Site Division was a shadowy federal unit that operated outside normal chains of command. Their presence confirmed Marcus's worst fears about what Mountain Valley Resources was really building. He spent the morning strengthening his defenses. The equipment from Baghdad had included more than just surveillance gear. There were weapons. 2, the kind that didn't appear in any official inventory. Marcus cleaned and checked each one with mechanical precision, his movements reflecting years of muscle memory. Sarah watched him work, noting how his hands never hesitated, never showed the slightest tremor. "You've been expecting this, haven't you, since they first showed up?" Marcus nodded. His hands moved in explanation. "Recognize the pattern. Same as Syria. They find isolated places, build hidden facilities, conduct experiments that can't exist on paper. But why here? Why our valley? Location," he signed. "Remote but accessible. Local water rights mass construction. Perfect cover for something bigger." Around noon, Thompson arrived with more news. He'd spotted unusual activity at one of Mountain Valley Resources' acquired properties, heavy equipment moving at night, strange sounds coming from underground. "And there's something else," Thompson added, his voice low. "People in hazmat suits. They're bringing in some kind of medical equipment, big stuff, like you'd see in a research hospital." Marcus's expression hardened. He wrote a quick note. "Time to see what they're really building." That night, Marcus prepared for a recon mission. He dressed in black tactical gear, his movements swift and sure as he checked his equipment. Sarah insisted on providing backup, monitoring surveillance feeds from the Cellar Command Center. "Your contact in Virginia sent more data," she said, through his earpiece as he moved through the darkness. "They've tracked similar facilities in remote areas across the country, all using water rights disputes as cover, all involving Colonel Haywood." Marcus moved silently across the valley, using the skills that had made him legendary in Delta Force. The facility Thompson had mentioned was heavily guarded, but Marcus had spent weeks mapping blind spots in their security. He reached the perimeter, undetected, his night vision gear revealing details the guards couldn't see. The facility's surface structure was typical for a water treatment plant, but thermal imaging showed extensive development underground. Multiple sub-levels. He signed to his body camera, knowing Sarah was recording everything. "Security patterns. Suggest containment protocols." "Marcus," Sarah's voice was tense in his earpiece. "Movement at your 3 o'clock. 2 guards, night vision equipped." He froze, becoming one with the shadows. The guards passed within feet of his position, their conversation carrying clearly in the night air. "Another shipment tomorrow night. Boss says this batch is different, enhanced somehow." "Yeah? Last batch didn't last long. Too unstable," they said. "This time's different. They've solved the genetic degradation issue. Subject 7 is still alive, still showing improvements." Marcus recorded everything, his tactical mind cataloguing details. The guards moved on, but their words confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a black site, it was a testing facility for something that violated every international law on human experimentation. He worked his way closer to the main building, using his thermal scanner to map the underground layout. The facility went deep, at least 6 levels below ground. But what caught his attention was a heavily secured area on the lowest level, its heat signature suggesting massive power consumption. "Found it," he signed. "Central lab complex. Heavy security, medical equipment, containment cells." "Marcus," Sarah's voice was urgent. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the north. Looks like a convoy, and they're bringing someone in." Through his scope, Marcus watched as black vans arrived at the facility's rear entrance. Men in tactical gear emerged, escorting a hooded figure. The person struggled weakly, their movements suggesting sedation. His hands moved in quick, angry signs. "Test subject, they're starting new trials. What's the play?" Marcus watched as they led the hooded figure inside. His throat ached with familiar tension, but his mind was clear. Whatever Mountain Valley Resources and Colonel Haywood were doing here, it went beyond simple land grabs or water rights. They were recreating the same program that had cost him his voice in Syria, but this time on American soil. "We shut them down," he signed. "Not just here, everywhere." Back at the ranch, Marcus compiled his evidence. The satellite photos, guard conversations, thermal scans, all of it painted a picture of something monstrous happening beneath the valley's surface. Sarah studied the data with growing horror. "This is why Haywood wanted you gone. You're the only one who knew about Syria, who could recognize the pattern." Marcus nodded grimly. His hands moved in the dim light. "They're testing something. Human enhancement program, like Syria but more advanced. The water rights." Cover story. "Underground facilities need water for cooling, waste disposal, perfect hide in plain sight." That night, Marcus received an encrypted message from his contact in Baghdad. "Weapon shipment arriving tomorrow. Special items you requested included. But Stone, satellite shows massive movement at all MVR sites. Something big is starting." Marcus stood at his window, watching the valley below. Mountain Valley Resources had built something inhuman in the darkness beneath his home. Tomorrow, they would learn why some secrets should stay buried. His hand touched his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he'd failed to stop them, had lost his voice trying to expose the truth. This time would be different. This time he had evidence, allies, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. The war for the valley wasn't just about land anymore. It was about stopping something that should never exist. Let them come with their federal agents and black site operators. They would learn what Colonel Haywood had forgotten, that some warriors don't need voices to speak truth to power, and that silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. The weapons arrived before dawn, delivered by a nondescript truck that disappeared into the morning mist. Marcus Stone inspected each crate methodically, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. This wasn't standard tactical gear. These were specialized weapons designed for assaulting hardened facilities, the kind of equipment that didn't officially exist. Sarah helped him inventory the shipment, her expression growing more serious with each crate. "Your contact in Baghdad doesn't mess around," she said, examining a set of breaching charges. This is serious hardware, Marcus." His hands moved in response. "Serious situations demand serious tools." They worked through the morning, preparing for what was to come. Marcus's satellite intelligence showed increased activity at Mountain Valley Resources facility. More guards, more deliveries, more unmarked vehicles arriving under cover of darkness. Whatever they were doing underground, it was accelerating. Sheriff Martinez arrived around noon, her patrol car kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. Her face was drawn with worry. "The feds are setting up checkpoints," she reported. "They're calling it a public health emergency, some story about contaminated groundwater. They're trying to lock down the valley." Marcus nodded. It was a standard containment protocol. Isolate the area, control movement, silence potential witnesses. His hands moved quickly. Time frame. 24 hours before the checkpoints are fully operational. After that, nothing moves without federal approval. Marcus pulled out his notepad. Then we move tonight. The plan was already formed in his mind, built on years of tactical experience and intimate knowledge of covert operations. He gathered his core team in the barn. Sarah, Sheriff Martinez, Thompson, and two new additions, former Delta Force operators who had arrived quietly the day before, answering the Silent Warrior's call. Using a combination of signs and written notes, Marcus laid out the operation. They would strike 3 targets simultaneously: the main research facility, the command center at the Pine Ridge Motel, and Mountain Valley Resources Communications Hub. The goal wasn't just to disrupt their operations, but to gather hard evidence of what was happening beneath the valley. "This is a one-way move," Dana warned. "Once we start, there's no going back." Marcus's response was grimly certain. "Already past that point. They're hurting people down there. Ends tonight." As dusk approached, final preparations were made. The Delta Force operators, Mike Chen and Ray Torres, checked their gear with professional precision. They had served with Marcus before Syria, knew his capabilities, trusted his judgment. "Just like old times, boss," Torres signed with a grin. Like many who had worked with Marcus, he had learned basic sign language. "Except this time, we're on home turf." The mission began at midnight. Marcus led the assault on the main facility, moving through the darkness like a ghost. Sarah coordinated from the command center, monitoring surveillance feeds and maintaining communications. Thompson and Martinez targeted the communications hub, while Chen and Torres hit the motel. Marcus's team reached the facility's perimeter undetected. The guards were alert but predictable, their patterns mapped over weeks of observation. He signaled to his team, 3 former Spec Ops contractors who owed him favors, and they moved into position. The first phase was a textbook: synchronized takedowns of exterior guards, security systems looped with pre-recorded footage, access points breached silently. But as they entered the facility, something felt wrong. The security was too light, the resistance too minimal. "Trap," Marcus signed to his team. But they were committed now and had to push forward. They reached the elevator shaft that led to the underground levels. Instead of risking the elevator itself, they used tactical rappelling gear to descend silently. Level by level, they passed. Reinforced doors and security checkpoints, each one suggesting something more sinister below. "Marcus," Sarah's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Chen's team just breached the motel. They found documents. It's worse than we thought. They're not just experimenting on volunteers. They're taking people, erasing their records, making them disappear." Marcus's jaw tightened. In his mind, he was back in Syria, discovering the true nature of the project that had cost him his voice. But this time, he had evidence. This time, he had the power to stop it. They reached the lowest level, where thermal imaging had shown the highest power consumption. The security here was different. Not just guards, but automated systems, biological sensors, containment protocols. This wasn't just a black site. It was a full-scale covert research facility. Through the reinforced windows, they saw labs filled with advanced medical equipment. Containment cells lined the corridors, each one monitored by sophisticated surveillance systems. And in one room, they found what they were looking for: documentation of Project Echo, complete with test results, subject profiles, and authorization signatures. "Multiple vehicles approaching," Sarah reported urgently. "Heavy tactical teams. They're mobilizing. Everything." Marcus signaled his team to begin planting charges at key structural points. They weren't here to destroy evidence. The charges were precisely placed to breach containment systems, trigger emergency protocols, force an evacuation that would expose everything to public view. But as they worked, alarms suddenly blared, emergency doors began sealing, and the sound of booted feet echoed through the corridors. They had company, serious company. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was tense. It's Colonel Haywood. He's here, leading the response team personally. Through the facility's internal cameras, Marcus watched Haywood direct his men with cold efficiency. The colonel was in full tactical gear, his movement suggesting he had expected this, had planned. "Und for it, you're surprised, Stone." Haywood's voice came through the facility's speaker system. "Did you think we wouldn't be ready? That we wouldn't have contingencies? You're good, but you've lost your edge, lost your voice, lost your nerve." Marcus touched his throat, feeling the familiar scar tissue there. But his hands moved with deadly certainty, signing to his team. "Show him how wrong he is." What followed was a masterclass in close-quarters combat. Marcus's team moved like shadows through the facility, using their knowledge of the layout to outmaneuver Haywood's forces. Every attempt to corner them was met with precise counterstrikes. Every aggressive push turned back against the attackers. "Bay 3 compromised," someone shouted over the radio. "They're in the primary containment area." "Stop them!" Haywood's voice cracked with real fear. "If those subjects get loose..." But it was too late. Marcus had reached the central control. A room. Through the armored glass, he could see them. People in medical containment units, their bodies showing signs of experimental procedures. Some were conscious, watching the chaos with desperate hope. His hands moved quickly, inputting commands into the system. Emergency releases activated, containment protocols disabled, automated security systems shut down. The facility's own fail-safes began working against it, designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic containment breach he had engineered. "Stone!" Haywood's voice was closer now, just outside the control room. "You have no idea what you're doing. These people, they're not victims, they're volunteers. We're creating something important here, something necessary." Marcus's response was to trigger the final sequence. Throughout the facility, charges detonated in precise patterns, not to destroy, but to expose. Emergency protocols forced automated calls to legitimate authorities. Containment breaches required official documentation. Everything would be recorded, logged, impossible to hide. "Fall back," Haywood ordered. "Initiate scorched earth, wipe everything." But Marcus had anticipated this too. His team had already secured the critical evidence, uploaded it to multiple secure locations. There would be no covering this up, no hiding what had happened here. As they made their escape through pre-planned routes, Marcus caught a glimpse of Haywood's face through the smoke and chaos. The colonel's expression wasn't angry, it was afraid. He had finally realized what his former operative had become. Not a broken soldier, but something far more dangerous. A warrior who had learned to turn silence itself into a weapon. Back at the ranch, as dawn broke over the valley, Marcus received confirmation from his other teams. The operation had succeeded beyond expectations. Mountain Valley Resources Command. Structure was in chaos. Their communications compromised, their secrets exposed. Sarah found him on the porch, watching federal vehicles race toward the facility. "It's over?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. His hands moved deliberately. "Not over, just beginning. What we found here, there will be more sites, more facilities. And we'll find them," she said with certainty. "We'll stop them all." Marcus nodded, touching the scar on his throat. In Syria, he had lost his voice trying to expose the truth. But here, in the valley he had chosen as his home, he had found something stronger than words. The power to right wrongs through action, to speak truth through deeds. The war wasn't over. But Mountain Valley Resources and Colonel Haywood had learned a crucial lesson. Some warriors don't need voices to fight. Some battles are won in silence. The morning after the raid brought chaos to the Gallatin Valley. Federal vehicles swarmed the exposed facility, their lights painting the dawn in red and blue. News helicopters circled overhead, drawn by anonymous tips about a major security incident. But Marcus Stone knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a larger storm. Sarah burst into his kitchen, her laptop clutched to her chest. "They're trying to contain it," she reported breathlessly. But it's too late. The data we uploaded is spreading. Independent journalists, foreign press, watchdog groups, they're all over it. Marcus watched the coverage on his secure feeds. His hands moved in precise signs. How's Haywood responding? That's the thing, Sarah said, pulling up more windows. He's gone, disappeared right after the raid. But look at this. Emergency flights leaving from private airfields all across the country. All heading to the same place. She showed him a map dotted with flight paths, all converging on a point in Nevada. Marcus's expression hardened. He knew what it meant. Project Echo wasn't confined to one facility. They had merely exposed one. Head of the Hydra. Sheriff Martinez arrived with more news, her cruiser's tires throwing gravel as she braked hard in the driveway. The feds are pulling out, she announced, striding into the kitchen. Not just the Black Site Division, all of them, like they were never here. Marcus nodded grimly. His notepad came out. They're clearing the board, preparing for something bigger. His satellite phone buzzed. A message from his contact in Virginia. Major activity at all known Echo sites. They're burning everything, Stone. Whatever you stirred up, they're scorched earth. But we got a hit on Haywood's private. Comms! Coordinates incoming! The coordinates led to a facility deep in the Nevada desert, far from any civilian population. Satellite imagery showed massive underground structures, heavy security, and the same pattern of water rights acquisitions they'd seen in Montana. It's their headquarters, Sarah realized, studying the images. The whole operation, this is where it all leads back to. Marcus's hands moved decisively. Where it ends, too. But before they could plan their next move, Thompson's truck came. Roaring up the drive, he jumped out, his face pale with urgency. They took Beth, he gasped. Henderson, black SUVs, professional grab team. Her boys tried to stop them, but Marcus was already moving, heading for his weapons cache. Sarah followed, reading his intent. Marcus, wait, this is what they want. They're baiting you. He turned to her, his signs sharp and clear. Don't care. Won't leave her. Then we do it. Smart, she insisted. We know their playbook now. Use it against them. Marcus's response was to demonstrate why enhancement wasn't everything. He engaged one of the augmented soldiers directly, using decades of training and experience to overcome raw power. The fight was brutal, but it proved a point, technique, and training still trumped artificial enhancement. As the battle wound down, with Haywood's forces retreating and Beth safely away, Marcus found a USB drive on one of the fallen soldiers. The data it contained was damning. Complete records of Project Echo's test subjects, including failed experiments and disposal protocols. Back at their temporary base, Sarah reviewed the files with horror. They're not just enhancing soldiers, she said. They're trying to create something else, something that shouldn't exist. Marcus nodded grimly. His hands moved in the dim light. Playing with forces they don't understand, just like Syria. What now? Torres asked, cleaning his weapon. With mechanical precision, Marcus's response was immediate. We end it, all of it. Nevada facility is the heart. Cut out the heart. They'll be waiting, Chen warned. After this, they'll throw everything they have at us. Marcus smiled coldly, his hands moving with deadly certainty. Counting on it, time they learned. Why silence is deadlier than sounds? That night, as they prepared for the final push, Marcus stood watching the stars. His hand went to his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he had lost his voice, trying to stop something inhuman. This time, he would finish what he started. Let them wait in their desert fortress with their enhanced soldiers and government. And backing, they were about to learn why his enemies had called him the Silent Warrior and why those who understood that name spoke it with fear. The war was entering its final phase, and Marcus Stone was ready. Some battles are won with bullets and bombs, others with stealth and strategy. But the most important victories are won by those who understand that true strength lies not in voice or violence, but in the unwavering will to stand against darkness, no matter the cost. The morning after the raid brought chaos to the Gallatin Valley. Federal vehicles swarmed the exposed facility, their lights painting the dawn in red and blue. News helicopters circled overhead, drawn by anonymous tips about a major security incident. But Marcus Stone knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a larger storm. Sarah burst into his kitchen, her laptop clutched to her chest. "They're trying to contain it," she reported breathlessly, "but it's too late. The data we uploaded is spreading. Independent journalists, foreign press, watchdog groups, they're all over it." Marcus watched the coverage on his secure feeds. His hands moved in precise signs. "How's Haywood responding?" "That's the thing," Sarah said, pulling up more windows. "He's gone, disappeared right after the raid. But look at this. Emergency flights leaving from private airfields all across the country, all heading to the same place." She showed him a map dotted with flight paths, all converging on a point in Nevada. Marcus's expression hardened. He knew what it meant. Project Echo wasn't confined to one facility. They had merely exposed one. Head of the Hydra, Sheriff Martinez arrived with more news, her cruiser's tires throwing gravel as she braked hard in the driveway. "The feds are pulling out," she announced, striding into the kitchen. "Not just the Black Site Division, all of them, like they were never here." Marcus nodded grimly. His notepad came out. "They're clearing the board, preparing for something bigger." His satellite phone buzzed, a message from his contact in Virginia. "Major activity at all known Echo sites. They're burning everything, Stone. Whatever you stirred up, they're scorched earth. But we got a hit on Haywood's private comms. Coordinates incoming." The coordinates led to a facility deep in the Nevada desert, far from any civilian population. Satellite imagery showed massive underground structures, heavy security, and the same pattern of water rights acquisitions they'd seen in Montana. "It's their headquarters," Sarah realized, studying the images. "The whole operation, this is where it all leads back to." Marcus's hands moved decisively. Where it ends, too. But before they could plan their next move, Thompson's truck came, roaring up the drive. He jumped out, his face pale with urgency. "They took Beth," he gasped. "Henderson, black SUVs, professional grab team. Her boys tried to stop them, but..." Marcus was already moving, heading for his weapons cache. Sarah followed, reading his intent. "Marcus, wait. This is what they want. They're baiting you." He turned to her, his signs sharp and clear. "Don't care. Won't leave her." "Then we do it." "Smart," she insisted. "We know their playbook now. Use it against them." Marcus paused, considering. She was right. Rushing in would play into their hands. His next signs were calmer, more tactical. "Call Chen and Torres. Time to show them what Delta Force can really do." The rescue operation came together with military precision. Marcus's team tracked the SUVs using satellite data and traffic cameras, while Sarah coordinated with their network of allies. The kidnappers were heading west, following a route that suggested they were bound for the Nevada facility. But Marcus had other plans. His hands flew through a detailed briefing. They would intercept the convoy before it reached its destination, using the same tactics Mountain Valley Resources had employed against the valley's residents. By nightfall, they were in position. The convoy would have to pass through a narrow canyon in western Wyoming, perfect terrain for an ambush. Marcus had chosen the location carefully, ensuring no civilians would be caught in the crossfire. The operation began with surgical precision. EMP devices disabled the convoy's electronics, while carefully placed charges forced them to stop. When the security team emerged, they found themselves caught in a perfectly executed crossfire. Marcus moved like a shadow through the chaos, his silence now a weapon of psychological warfare. The mercenaries, professional as they were, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't track, couldn't predict. One by one they went down to precise, non-lethal strikes. Beth was in the lead vehicle, shaken but unharmed. As Marcus helped her out, her eyes widened with recognition. You... She started, then stopped, understanding filling her face. All this time, we thought you were just... His hands moved quickly. Get her clear, he signed to Sarah. More coming. He was right. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the canyon, and familiar voices crackled over their captured radios. Colonel Haywood had taken personal command of the response team. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Stone. Haywood's voice carried clearly in the night air. We could have done this quietly, could have kept the bloodshed to a minimum, but now you've forced our hand. Marcus's response was to trigger the second phase of his plan. Throughout the canyon, hidden speakers activated, broadcasting recorded. Combat sounds that made it impossible to pinpoint real threats. Infrared strobes confused night vision equipment, while smoke generators obscured thermal imaging. You think these tricks will save you? Haywood demanded. You're not just fighting me anymore. The whole project is at stake. Do you understand what that means? What will they authorize to protect it? Marcus understood perfectly. His hands moved in the darkness, signing to his team. Now we have proof. They'll do anything to hide it. The battle in the canyon became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Marcus's smaller team used their environment and superior tactical knowledge to devastating effect. Every attempt to overwhelm them was turned back, every technological advantage neutralized by careful preparation. But as they fought, Marcus noticed something disturbing. Some of Haywood's men moved with inhuman speed and strength, shrugging off injuries that should have been debilitating. They were test subjects, he realized, products of Project Echo, turned into living weapons. See what we've created? Haywood's voice held a note of pride. This is what Echo can do, Stone. Perfect soldiers, unstoppable warriors, and you could have been part of it. Marcus's response was to demonstrate why enhancement wasn't everything. He engaged one of the augmented soldiers directly, using decades of training and experience to overcome raw power. The fight was brutal, but it proved a point. Technique and training still trumped artificial enhancement. As the battle wound down, with Haywood's forces retreating and Beth safely away, Marcus found a USB drive on one of the fallen soldiers. The data it contained was damning. Complete records of Project Echo's test subjects, including failed experiments and disposal protocols. Back at their temporary base, Sarah reviewed the files with horror. They're not just enhancing soldiers, she said. They're trying to create something else, something that shouldn't exist. Marcus nodded grimly. His hands moved in the dim light. Playing with forces they don't understand, just like Syria. What now? Torres asked, cleaning his weapon. With mechanical precision, Marcus's response was immediate. We end it, all of it. Nevada facility is the heart. Cut out the heart. They'll be waiting, Chen warned. After this, they'll throw everything they have at us. Marcus smiled coldly, his hands moving with deadly certainty. Counting on it. Time they learned. Why silence is deadlier than sounds. That night, as they prepared for the final push, Marcus stood watching the stars. His hand went to his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he had lost his voice, trying to stop something inhuman. This time, he would finish what he started. Let them wait in their desert fortress with their enhanced soldiers and government backing. They were about to learn why his enemies had called him the Silent Warrior, and why those who understood that name spoke it with fear. In the aftermath of the canyon battle, Marcus's team regrouped at an abandoned ranger station. Sarah worked tirelessly to decrypt more files from the captured drive, while Chen treated their wounds. The enhanced soldiers had done significant damage. Torres was nursing 3 broken ribs, and even Marcus's hardened frame showed the impact of superhuman strength. These files, Sarah said, her voice tight with tension, they detail something called Phase 3. The Nevada facility, it's not just their headquarters, it's where they're perfecting the process. Marcus moved closer to examine her screen. The documents revealed a horrifying truth. Project Echo wasn't just creating enhanced soldiers. They were attempting to fundamentally alter human capability, pushing beyond the limits of what flesh and bone could withstand. How many subjects? He signed. Hundreds, Sarah replied, scrolling through data. But the survival rate? She trailed off, her face pale. Less than 10% make it through the full process. The rest are listed as acceptable losses. Thompson, who had insisted on joining them after Beth's rescue, spoke up from his corner. Those things we fought, the enhanced ones, they weren't just stronger. Did you see their eyes? It was like there wasn't anything human left in them. Marcus nodded grimly. He had noticed it too. The blank stares, the mechanical movements, the complete absence of fear or hesitation. Project Echo wasn't just building better soldiers. They were stripping away humanity itself. His satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his contact in Baghdad. Package ready at designated coordinates. All items requested, plus something special. But Stone, satellite shows they're fortifying the Nevada site. Triple perimeter, air defense systems, subterranean barriers, whatever they're protecting down there, it's bigger than anything we've seen. Chen finished treating Torres's injuries and approached Marcus. I know that look, he signed. You're not just planning to expose them anymore. You're going to end it. Marcus's response was deliberate. They crossed a line, playing God with human lives, creating things that shouldn't exist. Like what they tried to do to you in Syria? Sarah asked quietly. Marcus paused, then nodded. For the first time, he signed the full story. Wasn't just an ambush, was a test. They wanted to see how their early subjects performed against elite operators. My team, we were lab rats to them. Expendable. Your voice, Thompson began. Price of surviving, Marcus signed. But I learned something valuable. They're enhanced soldiers, they're perfect weapons. They have a fatal flaw. What's that? They follow orders blindly. Can't adapt, can't think beyond their programming. That's why they'll fail. As night deepened, Marcus laid out his plan for the Nevada facility. It wasn't just about stopping Project Echo anymore. It was about ensuring nothing like it could ever happen again. They had the evidence, the tactical knowledge, and most importantly, the unshakable determination to see it through. Sarah watched him work, noting how his hands never wavered as he signed the details. You've been preparing for this since Syria, haven't you? All these years, living quietly, building connections, gathering resources. Marcus met her gaze and nodded. His next signs were slow, deliberate. Some battles take years to fight. Some wounds never heal. But some wrongs must be righted, no matter the cost. The team spent the rest of the night preparing. They cleaned weapons, checked gear, and studied the Nevada facility's layouts. Each of them knew this might be their last mission. Project Echo's leadership would throw everything they had at stopping them. But as Marcus watched his team work, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his days in Delta Force. Absolute certainty. They were ready, they were committed, and most importantly, they understood what was at stake. Tomorrow, they will begin their final push toward Nevada, toward Haywood, toward the heart of Project Echo. Let them wait with their enhanced soldiers and government backing. Let them think their fortress was impregnable, their secrets safe. They were about to learn why Marcus Stone had earned the name Silent Warrior, and why true strength lies not in artificial enhancement or brute force, but in the indomitable will to stand against darkness, no matter the personal cost. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its emptiness broken only by the occasional rock formation and the distant shimmer of heat mirages. Marcus Stone and his team had established their forward base in an abandoned mining complex, 30 miles from Project Echo's headquarters. The facility's massive underground structure was invisible from the surface, but satellite imagery showed the truth. A sprawling complex that dwarfed anything they'd seen in Montana. Sarah worked at their makeshift command center, coordinating with their network of allies. Latest intel shows increased activity, she reported. They're bringing in everything they have: personnel, equipment, test subjects. Whatever they're planning, it's reaching some kind of endgame. Marcus studied the tactical displays, his hands moving in precise signs. They're consolidating, protecting their core research. Chen and Torres were prepping their gear, an arsenal that would make most military units envious. The weapons dealer from Baghdad had outdone himself, providing them with cutting-edge equipment specifically designed to counter enhanced opponents. These should help level the playing field, Torres said, checking a specialized rifle. Armor-piercing rounds with a neural disruptor payload. Won't kill their super soldiers, but it'll scramble their enhanced systems. Marcus nodded approvingly. His own experience fighting the enhanced operatives had shown their vulnerabilities. Their augmentations made them stronger, faster, but also more dependent on the very systems that enhanced them. Thompson entered the command center, his face grim. Perimeter sensors just picked up something. Military channels are lighting up. They're mobilizing the entire Nevada National Guard. Official story is terrorist threat response exercise. Cover story, Marcus signed. They're creating a buffer zone, legal justification for whatever happens next. Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from their contact in Virginia. Critical update. Project Echo isn't just consolidating. They're preparing for mass production. The Nevada facility contains a fabrication center capable of processing hundreds of subjects simultaneously. Timeline shows activation within 48 hours. The implications hit them all hard. This wasn't just about stopping a black project anymore. They were racing against time to prevent the unleashing of an army of enhanced soldiers, stripped of humanity and programmed for absolute obedience. Marcus's hands moved with urgent precision. We move tonight. Can't wait any longer. The team gathered for the final briefing. Using a combination of signs and tactical displays, Marcus laid out their assault plan. It would be a three-pronged attack. Chen and Torres would lead a diversionary assault on the facility's main entrance, while Thompson and their support team would target the power infrastructure. Marcus and Sarah would infiltrate through the emergency ventilation system, a weakness they'd identified in the facility's blueprints. "What about Haywood?" Sarah asked. "He'll be expecting you." Marcus's response was grimly certain. "Counting on it. He needs to see it end." As dusk approached, they received one final intelligence update. Satellite imagery showed something disturbing. Medical evacuation helicopters arriving at the facility, carrying what appeared to be stasis pods. Fresh test subjects being delivered for processing. "No more waiting," Marcus signed. "We end this now." The assault began at midnight. Chen and Torres initiated their attack with spectacular effect, their specialized weapons proving devastatingly effective against the facility's enhanced guards. The neural disruptor rounds turned Project Echo's super soldiers into stumbling, disoriented targets. Thompson's team struck next, their charges taking out key power nodes. The facility's lights flickered and died, emergency systems casting everything in red emergency lighting. In the confusion, Marcus and Sarah made their approach. The ventilation shaft was a tight fit, but Marcus moved through it with practiced silence. Sarah followed, monitoring their tactical feeds. Through their infrared cameras, they could see chaos erupting throughout the facility. Guards rushing to respond, enhanced soldiers deploying in precise formations, scientists hurrying to secure their research. "Marcus," Sarah whispered through their secure comm, getting strange readings from the lower levels. Power consumption just spiked, and something's moving down there. Something big. They emerged into a secure corridor on the facility's third, underground level. The emergency lighting cast everything in crimson shadows, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Through reinforced windows, they could see laboratories filled with advanced medical equipment, stasis pods, and things that defied. Easy description. A security team rounded the corner, led by one of the enhanced soldiers. But Marcus was ready. He moved like liquid shadow, his attacks precise and devastating. The enhanced operative was stronger, faster, but Marcus had learned from their previous encounters. He used the soldier's augmented strength against him, turning every enhanced movement into a vulnerability. Sarah provided perfect support, using their electronic warfare gear to disrupt the security team's communications and tactical systems. Within moments, the threat was neutralized. "Marcus," Chen's voice crackled through their comm. "We've breached the main entrance, but something's wrong. These enhanced soldiers, they're different from the ones in Montana. More advanced. More wrong." Marcus could hear it in his old teammate's voice. The same horror he'd felt in Syria when he first discovered what Project Echo was really creating. His hands moved quickly, signing to Sarah. They're evolving them, making them less human with each iteration. They pushed deeper into the facility, encountering increasing resistance. But Marcus's team had trained for this, and had prepared specifically to counter enhanced opponents. Every engagement was a lesson in the superiority of skill and adaptability over raw power and programmed responses. Through it all, Marcus could feel Haywood's presence. The colonel was here, watching, directing his forces with cold efficiency. This was personal for him too, a final confrontation between two men who had once fought on the same side. They reached a massive blast door marked Primary Research Center. Beyond it lay the heart of Project Echo, and whatever horrors Haywood had created in his pursuit of the perfect soldier. Sarah worked quickly to bypass the security systems while Marcus stood guard. "Marcus," she said softly, "whatever's in there, are we ready for it?" His response was simple but determined. "Have to be. Can't let them finish what they started." The door began to open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a chamber that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, each containing a subject in various stages of enhancement. Massive medical apparatus hung from the ceiling, their purpose too terrible to contemplate. And there, at the chamber's center, stood Colonel Haywood. He wasn't alone. With him were a dozen of his most advanced subjects, their bodies twisted by enhancement, their eyes empty of anything human. "Welcome home, Stone," Haywood called out, his voice echoing in the massive space. "Come to see what you could have been, what you refused to become." Marcus stepped forward, his posture radiating deadly purpose. Behind him, Sarah prepared their final surprise. A dead man's switch that would transmit everything they found to every major news outlet and intelligence agency in the world. The war for the valley had led them here, to this underground chamber in the Nevada desert. But this wasn't just about land or water rights anymore. This was about stopping something that should never exist, about preserving what made humans human. As alarms blared and combat raged throughout the facility, Marcus Stone prepared for his final confrontation with the man who had once been his commander. Let Haywood come with his enhanced soldiers and twisted science. The silent warrior was ready to show him why some battles can only be won by those who remember their humanity. The endgame was beginning, and Marcus Stone intended to finish what he had started in Syria, not with words, but with the kind of silence that changes worlds. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its emptiness broken only by the occasional rock formation and the distant shimmer of heat mirages. Marcus Stone and his team had established their forward base in an abandoned mining complex 30 miles from Project Echo's headquarters. The facility's massive underground structure was invisible from the surface, but satellite imagery showed the truth, a sprawling complex that dwarfed anything they'd seen in Montana. Sarah worked at their makeshift command center, coordinating with their network of allies. "Latest intel shows increased activity," she reported. "They're bringing in everything they have, personnel, equipment, test subjects. Whatever they're planning, it's reaching some kind of end game." Marcus studied the tactical displays, his hands moving in precise signs. They're consolidating, protecting their core research. Chen and Torres were prepping their gear, an arsenal that would make most military units envious. The weapons dealer from Baghdad had outdone himself, providing them with cutting-edge equipment specifically designed to counter enhanced opponents. "These should help level the playing field," Torres said, checking a specialized rifle. "Armor-piercing rounds with a neural disruptor payload won't kill their super soldiers, but it'll scramble their enhanced systems." Marcus nodded approvingly. His own experience fighting the enhanced operatives had shown their vulnerabilities. Their augmentations made them stronger, faster, but also more dependent on the very systems that enhanced them. Thompson entered the command center. His face grim. Perimeter sensors just picked up something. Military channels are lighting up. They're mobilizing the entire Nevada National Guard. Official story is terrorist threat response exercise. "Cover story," Marcus signed. "They're creating a buffer zone, legal justification for whatever happens next." Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from their contact in Virginia. "Critical update. Project Echo isn't just consolidating. They're preparing for mass production. The Nevada facility contains a fabrication center capable of processing hundreds of subjects simultaneously. Timeline shows activation within 48 hours. The implications hit them all hard. This wasn't just about stopping a black project anymore. They were racing against time to prevent the unleashing of an army of enhanced soldiers, stripped of humanity, and programmed for absolute obedience. Marcus's hands moved with urgent precision. "We move tonight. Can't wait any longer." The team gathered for the final briefing. Using a combination of signs and tactical displays, Marcus laid out their assault plan. It would be a three-pronged attack. Chen and Torres would lead a diversionary assault on the facility's main entrance, while Thompson and their support team would target the power infrastructure. Marcus and Sarah would infiltrate through the emergency ventilation system, a weakness they'd identified in the facility's blueprints. "What about Haywood?" Sarah asked. "He'll be expecting you." Marcus's response was grimly certain. "Counting on it, he needs to see it end." As dusk approached, they received one final intelligence update. Satellite imagery showed something disturbing. Medical evacuation helicopters arriving at the facility, carrying what appeared to be stasis pods. Fresh test subjects being delivered for processing. "No more waiting," Marcus signed. "We end this now." The assault began at midnight. Chen and Torres initiated their attack with spectacular effect, their specialized weapons proving devastatingly effective against the facility's enhanced guards. The neural disruptor rounds turned Project Echo's super soldiers into stumbling, disoriented targets. Thompson's team struck next, their charges taking out key power nodes. The facility's lights flickered and died, emergency systems casting everything in red emergency lighting. In the confusion, Marcus and Sarah made their approach. The ventilation shaft was a tight fit, but Marcus moved through it with practiced silence. Sarah followed, monitoring their tactical feeds. Through their infrared cameras, they could see chaos erupting throughout the facility, guards rushing to respond, enhanced soldiers deploying in precise formations, scientists hurrying to secure their research. Marcus, Sarah whispered through their secure comm, getting strange readings from the lower levels. Power consumption just spiked and something's moving down there. Something big. They emerged into a secure corridor on the facility's third, underground level. The emergency lighting cast everything in crimson shadows, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Through reinforced windows, they could see laboratories filled with advanced medical equipment, stasis pods, and things that defied easy description. A security team rounded the corner, led by one of the enhanced soldiers. But Marcus was ready. He moved like a liquid shadow, his attacks precise and devastating. The enhanced operative was stronger, faster, but Marcus had learned from their previous encounters. He used the soldier's augmented strength against him, turning every enhanced movement into a vulnerability. Sarah provided perfect support, using their electronic warfare gear to disrupt the security team's communications and tactical systems. Within moments, the threat was neutralized. "Marcus," Chen's voice crackled through their comm, "we've breached the main entrance, but something's wrong. These enhanced soldiers, they're different from the ones in Montana. More advanced, more wrong." Marcus could hear it in his old teammate's voice. The same horror he'd felt in Syria when he first discovered what Project Echo was really creating. His hands moved quickly, signing to Sarah. "They're evolving them, making them less human with each iteration." They pushed deeper into the facility, encountering increasing resistance. But Marcus's team had trained for this, and had prepared specifically to counter enhanced opponents. Every engagement was a lesson in the superiority of skill and adaptability over raw power and programmed responses. Through it all, Marcus could feel Haywood's presence. The colonel was here, watching, directing his forces with cold efficiency. This was personal for him too, a final confrontation between two men who had once fought on the same side. They reached a massive blast door marked Primary Research Center. Beyond it lay the heart of Project Echo, and whatever horrors Haywood had created in his pursuit of the perfect soldier. Sarah worked quickly to bypass the security systems, while Marcus stood guard. "Marcus," she said softly, "whatever's in there, are we ready for it?" His response was simple but determined. "Have to be. Can't let them finish what they started." The door began to open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a chamber that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, each containing a subject in various stages of enhancement. Massive medical apparatus hung from the ceiling, their purpose too terrible to contemplate. And there, at the chamber's center, stood Colonel Haywood. He wasn't alone. With him were a dozen of his most advanced subjects, their bodies twisted by enhancement, their eyes empty of anything human. "Welcome home, Stone," Haywood called out, his voice echoing in the massive space. "Come to see what you could have been, what you refused to become." Marcus stepped forward, his posture radiating deadly purpose. Behind him, Sarah prepared their final surprise, a dead man's switch that would transmit everything they found to every major news outlet and intelligence agency in the world. The war for the valley had led them here, to this underground chamber in the Nevada desert. But this wasn't just about land or water rights anymore. This was about stopping something that should never exist, about preserving what made humans human. As alarms blared and combat raged throughout the facility, Marcus Stone prepared for his final confrontation with the man who had once been his commander. Let Haywood come with his enhanced soldiers and twisted science. The silent warrior was ready to show him why some battles can only be won by those who remember their humanity. Deep within the facility, Marcus and Sarah encountered something that made even their hardened hearts skip a beat. Through an observation window, they saw what appeared to be a training area, but the enhanced soldiers inside were moving with impossible speed and coordination, their bodies more machine than human. "My God," Sarah whispered, checking her tactical display. "They're Vital signs. They're barely registering as human anymore. Marcus studied the scene with professional detachment, but his hands moved with controlled anger. Final stage subjects, what they wanted to do to my team in Syria. They documented everything, their body cameras recording evidence that would shock the world. The enhanced soldiers were executing combat drills that defied physics, leaping impossible distances, shrugging off impacts that would shatter normal bones, moving with mechanical precision that spoke of minds rewritten at the deepest level. There, Com crackled with Torres's voice. "Marcus, we've found something. Research logs, documentation. They're not just making soldiers. They're trying to create something else, something worse." Before they could respond, a new sound filled the facility, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Emergency lights began flashing, and sealed doors throughout the complex started closing automatically. "Activation. Sequence initiated," an automated voice announced. "Phase 3 protocols engaged. All personnel proceed to designated safety zones." Sarah's hands flew over her tablet, accessing the facility's systems through their hacked connections. "Marcus, they're starting it. The mass production process. They're going to activate all the subjects at once." Through the facility's internal cameras, they watched as dozens of stasis pods began powering up. Each contained a subject in the final stages of enhancement. Soldiers, civilians, people who had volunteered or simply disappeared into Project Echo's machinery. "How long?" Marcus signed urgently. 20 minutes until full activation. After that, she didn't need to finish. They both knew what would happen if an army of enhanced soldiers, stripped of humanity and programmed for absolute obedience, was unleashed on the world. Marcus's hands moved with deadly certainty. "Chen, Torres, converge on our position. Thompson, initiate the final protocol." "Copy that," Thompson replied. "Charges set on all primary support structures. On your command, we can bring this whole place down." But as they moved to proceed deeper into the facility, something massive shifted in the darkness ahead. The enhanced soldier that stepped into view was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Nearly 8 feet tall, its body a nightmare fusion of flesh and cybernetic enhancement, its movements carrying the fluid grace of a predator. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Hayward's voice came through the facility's speakers. "The next stage of human evolution, what you could have been, Stone, if you'd had the vision to embrace change instead of fighting it." The enhanced soldier moved with impossible speed, closing the distance before Marcus could fully react. The impact sent him crashing into a wall with bone-crushing force, but Marcus had been preparing for this moment since Syria. His counterattack was perfectly timed, using the creature's momentum against it. Sarah provided crucial support, using their electronic warfare gear to disrupt the soldiers' enhanced systems. The creature stumbled, its movements becoming less coordinated as its augmentations glitched and faltered. The fight that followed was a brutal demonstration of why Marcus had earned his reputation in Delta Force. Despite being physically outmatched, he used every trick, every tactic, every hard-learned lesson to stay alive. His silence became an advantage. No wasted breath, no verbal tells, just pure lethal efficiency. "Marcus," Sarah called out, her voice urgent. "More signatures are approaching. They're releasing all of them." Through the facility's cameras, they could see it happening. Enhanced soldiers emerging from stasis, moving with that same inhuman precision. But something was wrong. Some of the subjects were rejecting their programming, their enhanced bodies convulsing as humanity fought against artificial control. "No!" Hayward's voice carried genuine fear now. Contain them all." Marcus used the distraction to end his fight, finally putting down the enhanced soldier with a precise series of strikes to key neural clusters. Weaknesses he had identified in their previous encounters. Chen and Torres arrived, their specialized weapons showing signs of heavy use. "Lower levels are in chaos," Chen reported. The subjects, some of them are turning on the staff. It's like they're waking up. Marcus nodded grimly. His hands moved with urgent purpose. Their fatal flaw can't completely erase human nature, not without destroying what they're trying to enhance. Sarah's tablet beeps with new data. Marcus, Haywood's in the central control room. He's initiating some kind of fail-safe protocol. Through the security feeds, they could see the colonel working frantically at a massive control panel. Behind him, through armored glass, rows of new subjects waited in stasis, hundreds of them ready for processing. He'll kill them all, Marcus signed, rather than risk losing control. Then we stop him, Sarah said firmly. End this once and for all. Marcus gathered his team for the final push. Each of them knew the stakes, not just stopping Project Echo, but preventing something fundamentally inhuman from being unleashed on the world. The central control room was just ahead, guarded by the last of Haywood's loyal enhanced soldiers. But Marcus Stone had not come this far to fail. The silent warrior had a message to deliver, not with words, but with the kind of silence that ends nightmares. Let Haywood wait with his fail-safe protocols and twisted vision of evolution. He was about to learn why some weapons are most deadly when you never hear them coming. The central control room of Project Echo's Nevada facility loomed before them like a high-tech fortress. Through reinforced windows, Marcus Stone could see Colonel Haywood working frantically at the main console, surrounded by screens showing chaos erupting throughout the complex. Enhanced subjects were breaking free of their programming, turning on their creators, while others remained locked in their pods, awaiting a fate worse than death. 2 minutes until fail-safe activation, Sarah reported, her fingers flying over her tablet. If those pods initiate emergency termination protocols, Marcus's hands moved with deadly certainty. Won't let that happen. The last line of defense before them consisted of Haywood's elite guard, 4 enhanced soldiers from the latest generation, their bodies more machine than human. They moved with perfect coordination, their vacant eyes tracking every movement. Chen and Torres took up firing positions, their specialized weapons ready. Like old times, boss, Torres signed quickly, just with bigger odds. Marcus nodded, then gestured to Sarah. Initiate final override. Sarah activated their last surprise, a virus specifically designed to target Project Echo's control systems. Throughout the facility, lights flickered and security doors began cycling randomly. The enhanced soldiers stumbled slightly as their augmented systems encountered conflicting commands. That moment of confusion was all Marcus needed. He moved, like a ghost, years of Delta Force training combining with hard-learned lessons about fighting enhanced opponents. The first soldier went down to a precise strike at the junction between organic spine and artificial enhancement. The second, barely, had time to react before Marcus exploited another weakness, the dependency on computerized targeting systems that could be disrupted. Chen and Torres engaged the others with their specialized weapons, the neural disruptor rounds, playing havoc with enhanced reflexes. But these opponents were far more advanced than those they'd faced in Montana. Even disrupted, they fought with terrifying efficiency. Sarah maintained her position, coordinating the electronic warfare that kept the facility in chaos. Through her feeds, she could see Thompson's team fighting their way toward the power core, ready to bring the whole complex down if necessary. The battle before the control room was a demonstration of why Marcus had earned his reputation as the silent warrior. Each movement was precisely calculated, each attack targeted at specifically researched vulnerabilities. Where enhanced soldiers relied on programmed responses and artificial strength, Marcus brought decades of experience and adaptable strategy. Marcus, Sarah's voice carried urgent warning. Power spike in the stasis pods. He's starting the termination sequence. Through the armored glass, they could see Haywood's face. Not triumphant, but desperate. The colonel knew his project was falling apart, his vision of engineered evolution crumbling as human nature reasserted itself in his enhanced subjects. The last of the elite guards fell, their enhanced bodies betrayed by the very augmentations, meant to make them invincible. Marcus approached the control room's sealed door, but Haywood's voice stopped him cold. "You know what's funny, Stone?" The colonel's voice carried through the speakers. "You were right. Back in Syria, when you tried to stop the first trials, said we couldn't erase human nature without destroying what made soldiers effective in the first place. But that's exactly what we needed to do." Marcus's hands moved in response, with Sarah translating. "You lost your humanity long before you started enhancing soldiers." "Humanity?" Haywood laughed bitterly. "Humanity is weak. Conscience, emotion, free will, their evolutionary baggage. We're building something better, something pure." The door's locks began cycling as Sarah's override took effect. But Haywood wasn't finished. "You think exposing this stops anything? There are other sites, other projects." "The future is coming, Stone. With or without your approval." The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the control room was a temple of advanced technology, with the stasis pod chamber visible below through a massive observation window. Hundreds of subjects hung suspended in their pods, their bodies already showing signs of enhancement. Haywood stood at the main console, his finger hovering over what was clearly a dead man's switch. "One step closer, and I initiate total termination. Everything ends. All subjects, all evidence, all of it." Marcus stopped, but his posture radiated deadly calm. His hands moved deliberately. "Like Syria, killing your own men to hide the truth?" "They were soldiers," Haywood snapped. "They understood sacrifice, just like these volunteers understood the risks." "Volunteers." Sarah's voice dripped with disgust. "We found your acquisition records, people who disappeared, who were pressured, who were given no choice." "Choice is another weakness," Haywood said. "The future doesn't ask permission, Stone. It demands compliance." But as he spoke, something was happening in the stasis chamber below. The subjects were moving, fighting against their restraints. The facade of enhanced perfection was cracking as human will reasserted itself against programmed obedience. "No," Haywood's composure finally broke. "This is impossible. The programming is absolute." Marcus's hands moved with grim satisfaction. "Human spirit is stronger than your programming." He struck then, moving with the speed and precision that had made him legendary in Delta Force. Haywood may have been enhanced himself, but he'd never matched Marcus's combat experience. The colonel managed one augmented blow that cracked ribs before Marcus took him down with a targeted strike to neural control clusters. Sarah rushed to the main console, her fingers flying over the controls. "Termination sequence aborted. Initiating." Emergency release protocols. Throughout the facility, stasis pods began opening. Enhanced subjects emerged, many of them confused, others angry, but all of them reclaiming their free will. Project Echo's perfect soldiers were becoming human again. "You've doomed us all," Haywood gasped from the floor. "Without perfect compliance. They're just monsters, weapons without control." Marcus's response was to trigger the facility's emergency broadcast system. His hands moved in clear, deliberate signs as Sarah translated for everyone to hear. "Not monsters, not weapons, humans. With all our flaws and strengths, that's what you never understood. Our humanity isn't a weakness, it's our greatest strength." The facility's data began uploading to their secure servers, evidence that would expose Project Echo to the world. Thompson's team reported all charges set. They could bring the whole complex down, burying the darkest aspects of the project forever. But as Marcus watched the enhanced subjects helping each other, showing the humanity that no amount of programming could fully erase, he made a different call. This facility wouldn't be destroyed. It would be transformed, a place of healing where Project Echo's victims could reclaim their humanity. "What about the other sites?" Sarah asked. "The other projects?" Marcus's response was resolute. "We hunt them all down, end them all, whatever it takes." Hours later, as federal authorities swarmed the facility and news helicopters circled overhead, Marcus stood watching the sunrise over the Nevada desert. His hand went to his throat, feeling the scar tissue there. In Syria, he had lost his voice trying to stop this nightmare from beginning. Now he had ended it without speaking a word. Sarah found him there, her tablet showing news headlines already. "Breaking worldwide. They're calling it the biggest Black Project scandal in history," she said. "Project Echo, Mountain Valley Resources, all of it exposed." Marcus nodded, then signed. "Back to the ranch," she smiled. "Back to the valley. But something tells me our quiet days are over." He allowed himself a small smile. His next signs were unhurried. "Some battles need silence, others need truth. We'll face whatever comes next." The sun climbed higher over the desert, painting the world in shades of gold. In the facility below, Project Echo's victims began their journey back to humanity. The war that had begun in a quiet Montana valley had ended here in the Nevada desert. But Marcus Stone knew his work wasn't finished. Let them come with their secret projects and enhanced soldiers. The silent warrior would be ready. Some battles are won with weapons and words, others with silence and truth. But the most important victories are won by those who remember that our humanity, with all its flaws and feelings, is not weakness, but strength. The world would soon know the truth about Project Echo, about Mountain Valley Resources, about the price of trying to engineer away what makes us human. And in a quiet valley in Montana, a ranch would stand as testament to the fact that sometimes the strongest warriors are those who need no voice to speak truth to power. Marcus Stone turned toward home, toward the mountains and valleys that had given him purpose after Syria. His silence was no longer a wound, but a weapon. His scars no longer a reminder of failure, but a mark of triumph. The war was over. But if darkness rose again, the silent warrior would be ready. Some battles change the world, not with shouts and speeches, but with the kind of silence that echoes through history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.